For more on the situation inside Iran, New York Times reporter Thomas Erdbrink is in Tehran. Joining me here in Los Angeles, Democratic strategist Dave Jacobson and Republican consultant John Thomas. Also, CNN's Claire Sebastian in Moscow following a minor easing of U.S. sanctions on Russia. And journalist Shalaya Medora is in Canberra with fallout from Donald Trump's heated phone call with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull.
And we want to start, of course, with New York Times correspondent Thomas Erdbrink, who joins me now from Tehran. And Thomas, I was reading your article in the New York Times in which you say the Iranian establishment is treading carefully in the face of this new hostile, as you say, Trump administration. What has been the reaction there to talk of possible Iranian sanctions?
Well, obviously, the Iranians are very unhappy with possible sanctions being slapped on them. Of course, the Iranians themselves feel that there's nothing wrong with their missile test. But when they look at Donald Trump's tweets, they go far beyond only the missile test. They speak of Iran's influence in neighboring country Iraq. They speak of other matters. So the Iranians are very careful because where normally they were the unpredictable factor in international politics, suddenly, in their view, Donald Trump has become the unpredictable factor. So they're eagerly waiting to see what the sanctions will be and what they will entail.
So walking and treading carefully, lots of caution there. Thomas Erdbrink, New York Times, thank you very much. John?
Well, Isa, let's bring in Dave Jacobson and John Thomas now. Okay, so John, this is it. This is the officially on notice, the big dramatic entrance into the briefing room on Wednesday, the double secret probation. It's more sanctions. That's it?
To start.
Okay.
The question is, they have to walk up to that line, and then where do they go from there? I don't know. I do know that the Trump administration wants to tear up that Iran nuclear deal, so that's my hunch, is that's what they're working on. How do they get that done, and then what are the next steps after that?
Have they created their own red line here, Dave, whether they like it or not?
It's possible. I mean, but the real question here is, like, what happens if that theoretical red line gets broken? Like, is there really an appetite among the American people to go into a third war? We're already still in our longest war ever in Afghanistan, and now we're tackling ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so the question is, like, do we have the resources for that? Do we have the public on the president's side? And I don't think he does.
It's interesting, though, because, Donald Trump said military options are on the table. President Obama said that. They're talking about more sanctions, exactly what the Obama administration was talking about as well. So, Dave, is it too early to declare a continuity of foreign policy here?
Right. I mean, we're supposed to see this radical shift in foreign policy. He was cozying up to Vladimir Putin, but now they're criticizing President Putin for, the actions in Crimea. And then now you've got this talk of potential sanctions in Iran. So I do think he's coming off as somewhat hypocritical after berating President Obama for the last 8 years. He's implementing, or at least pivoting, into a strategy that's reflective of President Obama.
I think the challenge is Donald Trump has inherited a situation where his back's up against the wall. He can't go in guns blazing. He has to
But isn't that what he did in Iran, though?
Well, but he has to start to unravel what President Obama has caused for the last 8 years and retrain both our allies and our foes how to treat us.
It's all Obama's fault. Stay with us.
It is for now.
There also seems to be a nuanced shift in Donald Trump's position on Israel, with the White House warning that new settlement activity in the West Bank could potentially hamper the peace process. More details now from Elise Lavitt.
Well, John, on Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's first day on the job, one of his first calls was to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Hours later, the White House issued a statement on settlements. You know, the Israeli government has announced about 5,500 new settlement homes since President Trump took office, most larger than in recent years. Now, the statement says, and let me quote a little bit from it, "While we don't believe the existence of settlements is an impediment to peace, the construction of new settlements or the expansion of existing settlements beyond their current borders may not be helpful in achieving that goal." Now, the Israelis I've talked to don't see this statement as that bad. President Obama had said the settlements were an impediment to peace, and this statement doesn't take issue with Israel building within settlement blocks, which President Obama did. Now, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are expected to meet in a few weeks. The White House says it will be developing a formal settlement policy then. Now, all of this coming amid Trump's tense phone calls with the leaders of Australia and Mexico. He defended this confrontational tone at the National Prayer Breakfast on Thursday, saying it's time to get tough. John?
Okay, Elise, thank you. Dave, this shift in the attitude towards Israel is when it came to settlements. It came a few hours after President Trump sat down and met with King Abdullah of Jordan. It was a sort of unscheduled meeting, but it happened anyway on the sidelines of the National Prayer Breakfast. One of the issues officially that was talked about, safe zones in Syria, but you pretty much guaranteed that they talked about the problems or the concerns that King Abdullah has about settlement activity in the West Bank. So my question, does this go to the concern that the president is left with the view of the last person he spoke to?
It's quite possible. And by the way, on the issue of President Trump meeting with the King of Jordan, one of the things that I think was noteworthy was he didn't invite him to the White House when he was in the country. Well, he's having a meeting with the Vice President at the White House, but not with the President of the Oval Office.
But it was actually scheduled with Trump, and he invited him back for an official visit later. Nothing was on the agenda, so...
Right, but I do think it's a testament, you're right, I do think it's a testament to the fact that the President goes the way oftentimes with the person that he spoke with last. But I think this is an indication that it is potentially possible that the President is perhaps doing some of his homework and maybe reading some of those briefings that he wasn't reading before, and understanding fundamentally that if you want a two-state solution, if you want peace in the Middle East, this is an issue that is not going to be helpful. If you're fanning the flames of more of these settlements, it's not going to help the peace process. And I think broadly, in a bipartisan level, Democrats and Republicans both support a two-state solution.
John, this was a day that seemed a lot more normal in the way foreign policy is meant to happen. Rex Tillerson spoke to the Israeli government, concerned that they weren't informed about the settlement announcement, that there'd be a new settlement, talked about the desire for a two-state solution. So, after a rocky couple of days, it does seem almost, I don't want to say too soon, but almost like it's settling down.
This is just indicative that the Trump administration has a diplomatic arm. You have Nikki Haley, who's starting to get her sea legs, and Rex Tillerson is finally starting to have the president's ear. I think that's more what it's about. It's less about the president being whipsawed by the person he meets with as much as he's getting good, rock-solid advice from a good Secretary of State.
Maybe they shouldn't have fired everybody at the State Department. And Dave, it does look like the Israeli Prime Minister is learning the same lesson that the Australian Prime Minister learned over the last couple of days. You never know what you're going to get with Donald Trump.
Well, and I think that's the thing. You've seen this flip-flop throughout the course of the last 2 years in the presidential campaign. Donald Trump was for punishing women who had abortions, and then he wasn't, right? And I think that's the question. I think, look, the conversation that Donald Trump had with the president or the Prime Minister of Australia, I think is a testament to how other world leaders are going to look at him. He's a bully. He's blunt. He could be mean-spirited, and this is how he's going to behave as a president. It's reckless. It's irresponsible, but it's just the reality.
Okay, you're not weighing in. Good. Okay. So he says some tough words there for Israel. The new administration also has a tougher tone with Russia, while also modifying some sanctions.
Tweaking, yes. A slight tweak, John. The U.S. Treasury Department is making it easier for some companies, at least, to do limited business with Russia's Federal Security Service, the former KGB. The State Department calls it a technical fix. Those are his words. And President Donald Trump insists it's not an easing of sanctions. Meantime, UN Ambassador Nikki Haley made her first appearance at the Security Council on Thursday, and she had this to say on Russia.
The United States continues to condemn and call for an immediate end to the Russian occupation of Crimea. Crimea is a part of Ukraine. Our Crimea-related sanctions will remain in place until Russia returns control over the peninsula to Ukraine.
Well, let's bring in CNN's Claire Sebastian, who joins us from Moscow. And Claire, what do these adjustments mean, and how is it being received by Vladimir Putin? As well, if you can touch on what we just heard there from the UN.
Absolutely. So, well, this is a small technical fix. Basically, what happened was when the Obama administration put in that wave of sanctions in December over alleged Russian interference in the U.S. elections, that included a blanket sanction on the FSB, the Russian State Security Service. And that, unfortunately, had the unintended consequence of preventing some business that American companies were doing in Russia. The FSB has another duty. It also issues licenses for companies to import and distribute certain technological products in this country. So that was one unintended consequence, as the U.S. Treasury called it. So this essentially carves out a loophole for limited business by those companies in Russia. It's only up to $5,000 a year per company. But as for the reaction here in Russia, well, an initial wave of optimism, perhaps. We saw a little spike in the ruble when this news came out, and certainly Russian media reports have been referring to this as a loosening or softening of sanctions, something that, of course, you heard the Treasury and the U.S. president have denied. But that wave of optimism dampened overnight. The Kremlin telling CNN's Matthew Chance, we care, but not that much. And of course, those comments from Nikki Haley certainly reducing that sense of optimism that this is an immediate rapprochement between Russia and the United States, Isa.
Claire Sebastian for us there in Moscow. Very good to see you, Claire. Thanks very much. John?
Okay, so Dave and John, Senator Lindsey Graham has been one of many Republicans who want a much tougher action on Russia. Listen to the senator.
I will never be satisfied until the Congress and the White House work together to punish Russia for trying to interfere with our election. I don't think they changed the outcome, but they clearly tried to manipulate the outcome. So the current sanctions are in place based on their taking of Crimea. There needs to be new sanctions imposed against Russia for interfering in our election. So I'm working with Democrats and Republicans to pass new sanctions. I hope the president will embrace them because Russia needs to be punished.
Okay, John, so the position that we're now hearing from Donald Trump through Nikki Haley at the UN, that sort of brings him at least closer to his own party. In some ways.
Yeah, well, in some ways it does. I think the technical easing today is more...
Yeah, it was a wash,
and it is, and it's also just Trump doesn't want to punish Americans over something Obama put in place.
But the issue of being tougher on Russia when it comes to Crimea, standing up, calling it an invasion.
Again, I mean, I hate to be a broken record, but I really do think that this has to do with a little bit of Nikki Haley, but it's really a Rex Tillerson influence that clearly has Donald Trump's ear.
But I think it's plausible. This is a bipartisan issue. I think, and I applaud Senator Lindsey Graham. I think Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, Capitol Hill alike, both think that we need to dig deep and investigate further into the Russian hacking. Nobody wants our elections undermined by a foreign entity. This is the equivalency of Watergate by a foreign actor. And so I think this is a major issue. We ought to look into it, make sure that it never happens again.
Yeah, on the issue of the modified sanctions, I mean, this is a slight technicality. It was really nothing at the end of the day, but a lot of Democrats jumped the gun. They accused the administration of rewarding Russia for bad behavior. Dave, given all the hype, all the controversy which has been created by Donald Trump, Democrats, I guess, how careful do they have to be that they don't accuse Trump of doing something which he hasn't done? Because there's plenty of material out there. This is a credibility issue.
Somewhat, but look, I think largely Donald Trump has never said one thing negative about Vladimir Putin. It pained him to say anything about acknowledging the hacking in the first place, right? And so I think Democrats have a leg up in the conversation when it comes to Russia on anything at this point.
This is just, the problem is they're using generic talking points that could be applicable. Anything Donald Trump says is wrong. It's a Supreme Court nominee, and it didn't matter who it was. He's extreme and out of the mainstream, even though he's not.
Yeah.
They need to adjust, or else all this hysteria will end up just being crying wolf.